All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. If you haven't already, please grab some pizza. And I think pizza's on this side and beer's on this side. So please enjoy. So welcome to Front-End Developers United. This is a monthly meetup that we run pretty much once a month. We've been pretty good about doing that since the start of the year when we had our first session. We have a meetup page, which is probably how most of you guys heard about this talk tonight. But if you haven't, go ahead and check it out, and we'll be announcing future meetups on that site. So thanks again for coming. So just a little bit about me. First of all, my name is Seth McLaughlin. I work here at LinkedIn. I'm an engineer on the internal tools team. I work a lot on different testing frameworks and tools to help people effectively test their code and be more productive as a result. So tonight we're going to be talking a lot about my favorite topic, which is JavaScript. So who here would consider themselves a JavaScript developer? All right. How about you in the back? What kind of JavaScript do you write?
Front-end JavaScript.
Front-end, so code that runs in a browser. Okay. Great. Anybody else? Anybody write Node or server-side JavaScript? No? All right. Well, that's okay. Tonight we're actually focusing mostly on front-end client-side JavaScript, so that's perfect. Do you write tests for your code that you write? Fantastic. So you're ahead of the game. For those of you who may not have started with JavaScript testing yet, hopefully after tonight you'll be inspired and excited to actually start writing tests. I think a lot of people, when they first hear the word testing or unit testing or test-driven development, it's really easy to think, that sounds like a lot of work. I don't really want to do that. I just want to write code that works. I want to get stuff out there that looks great and makes people happy, makes the users happy when they use the code. Fortunately, if you don't write good quality code, you're not going to make anybody happy. You're especially not going to make yourself happy when you have to fix something late at night and you get a phone call. So hopefully I'll also be able to convince you of that if you're not already on board with the whole testing concept. So tonight we're going to go over a couple of different things. I'm basically starting with the assumption that most of you have not done a lot of JavaScript unit testing. You may not even have written a lot of JavaScript. If you have, that's fine. I think you'll still learn quite a few things tonight, hopefully. I'll do my job well. The first thing we're going to cover is different methods of testing. So when you're writing a web application, there's different strategies for testing your code, right? And we'll talk about the different tools and techniques that are available to you as a developer. We're also going to talk about, specifically we're going to go into JavaScript unit testing, right? That's the title of the talk. So we're going to talk about how JavaScript unit testing is a form of automated white box testing, and we'll get into those terms and explain what they mean. And finally, we're going to talk a lot about Venus.js, which is a tool developed here at LinkedIn for helping you write and run your JavaScript unit tests in a very automated fashion. So, different types of testing. Can anybody tell me what black box testing means? Is anybody familiar with this term? I know it's, okay.
Throw the code in there and see what it does, and you have no idea why.
Okay. That's a fairly good explanation. The way I think about it is black box testing is when you write a test from the user's perspective, right? You don't have any knowledge of how the code actually works, how it's implemented. You just know kind of how you expect, what you expect to see on the screen after you click a button or after you submit a form or something like that, right? And then you also have white box testing. So white box testing is tests that are written from the developer's perspective. So this is where you do have an underlying knowledge of the code. And you say, okay, well, I know, I'm kind of calculating a value in this way, so I want to make sure I throw a bunch of different cases at it to see if it's behaving in the way I expect in all of the scenarios that you want to support. So that may sound a little bit abstract, so what I thought I would do next is actually get into an example. So imagine that you're working on a new website, and you need to build a control for your website that will allow your user to type in to the box and get some results down below. So commonly we refer to this as type ahead. Type ahead control, you probably have seen this on pretty much every major website you visited. It's pretty standard. So I want to show you an example of this in action. Whoop, getting ahead of myself. Okay, so here we have a simple website that I've pretended I've built, and this page is a sign-up form, right? So we're asking the user, what's your name? Do you like JavaScript? Hopefully they do. And where are they from? So this where are you from box is going to be our type ahead. So if I were to test this in a black box fashion, I would literally load the website that I've created. Everything's working together. You have CSS, you have JavaScript, you have HTML, you probably have some server-side code running in this environment as well. I load it up in a web page as if I was a user, and I just type in a letter and see if what I expect to happens, right? And it does. In this case, that's great. I type M, and I get a list of states that match M. So that's perfect. And that's a very simple example of black box testing. So on the other hand, if I want to test the same control, but from a white box perspective, how would that work? Well, I could open up Developer Tools, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. This is Chrome Developer Tools, which allows me to go into a JavaScript console where I can execute JavaScript within the context of this web page. So since I happen to know a bit about the code, since I wrote it, I know I have this global variable defined called typeAhead. And I happen to know that it has a filter data method attached to it. So I'm going to test this to see, okay, if I send it M, what is it going to give me back? And it gives me an array of values, right? And these are the same values that showed up in the UI, but we're seeing this at a much lower level. And this is really interesting because you can imagine if you just did black box testing and you or a QA engineer on your team went and tested this web page and it didn't work, if they typed in M and nothing showed up, that's obviously bad, but you really don't know where the problem is, right? There could be a CSS problem. There could be a problem getting data from a server. It's unclear. The nice thing about white box testing, which is what we're going to be talking a lot about tonight in regards to unit testing, is that you're much closer to the code. So when you do find problems, it's oftentimes much easier to figure out exactly where the problem is. Okay, so black box versus white box. We have these two different types of tests. I'm not saying one is bad and one is good. They both have their uses, right? Even though white box testing lets you be closer to code and find bugs, probably more quickly and more specifically to where the bugs are, black box testing is great because that's the finished product, right? I mean, that's what you're actually sending out to your users. So you want to make sure that that is, once everything's been totally put together with the CSS and the JavaScript and everything, that it's working as you expect. So they're both good. They both have their own place. One thing that I don't really like is this concept of manual testing, right? And that's what we just did a moment ago. So we had to manually open up a web browser. We had to manually click in a box, manually type something, manually visually see, okay, does this look the way I expect it to? Then when we did white box testing, we had to manually open up the browser, manually open the developer console, and say, does this look right? The problem with manual testing, which I think pretty much everybody agrees on, is that it's slow, it's error-prone, and it's definitely not the ideal solution. So what can we do about that? Well, we can automate our tests, right? I mean, we've been doing that in all kinds of different languages for a long, long time. And within the last couple of years, it's been becoming more and more popular to write automated JavaScript tests, which is great, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I don't want to get too hung up on terminology. I don't think it's really that important. What I usually think about in terms of your automated black box tests, I usually would call those functional tests or end-to-end tests. White box typically refers to unit tests. So what tools do we have to write those tests? Well, we have Selenium to write black box end-to-end functional tests. Has anybody here used Selenium? Yeah, a good number. Most people, when they start testing front-end code, that's usually the level that they'll start testing at, black box test with Selenium, which is great. It's a really popular tool. It works really well. It's been around for a while. It's really well supported, so I highly recommend it. White box testing is with unit testing in JavaScript has only really started to gain traction within the last year or two. We started working on Venus about a year ago. There's also a couple other really cool projects out there now. You may have heard of Karma. I think there's one that came out recently called The Intern. So it's becoming a more developed area, which is awesome for developers. We happen to think Venus is pretty cool, and hopefully by the end of tonight you'll agree as well. The other thing that I hope that you'll agree with by the end of tonight is that when you hear this term, JavaScript unit testing, I don't want you to be scared by it. I don't want you to think, oh, it's a lot of work, it's going to be annoying, I don't want to do this. I want you to get this expression on your face when you hear JavaScript unit testing. I want you to be happy and excited about doing it, because I definitely am. Okay, so what exactly is a unit test? Or specifically, with JavaScript, what are the components that go into making a unit test, right? How does it all work? So essentially, you have these two items, right? You have your source code, which is the code that you're developing with all the features that you're trying to build. And then you have your test code, which is code that calls into your source code, calls methods on your code, and checks the response. And you see if you get the data back that you expect for that method call. So it's a very low level, very granular type of test. Now, we also have to have this artifact called the test harness page. And all this really is, it's kind of a fancy term, it's just an HTML page, right? It's just a page where you do your script includes, get both of those sets of code wired up into a page so that you can load that in a browser. Speaking of browsers, we have a lot to deal with, right? I mean, anybody who's been doing web development knows one of the joys of web development is that you get to develop for a lot of different platforms. These are the top browsers that we have up there on the screen here. We have IE, we have Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Opera, and while there are standards, unfortunately, there's always going to be differences. You always have to test each environment you're running your code in to make sure that it's working as you expect. And that's one of the challenges we'll talk about. Here's an example of some code that will work fine in pretty much all the browsers we showed right there, but it's not going to work very well in all of them. Does anybody see what's going to break in some of the older versions of IE? Yeah, that's right. So bind is not supported in IE previous to 9. So hopefully your developer knows that, but maybe they forgot. So if you have a unit test, you can just run it quickly through that browser. You can catch that problem before your code even goes to your QA team, or let alone production, which would be unfortunate. So let's go ahead and actually write a test. I'm going to start from the very basics. Okay, oops. All right. So for the purposes of this example, I've coded up a very simple JavaScript object. We have this function that we're going to use as a function constructor, and we're calling it tools. And we're going to have a couple of functions or methods on here. So essentially all we're doing, we have an array, and we're going to expose a method that lets us add an item to a collection. And then we're going to have a method that lets us get the primary item from the collection. So it's pretty simple stuff. So how are we going to go about actually writing the test? Well, I need to have a harness page that I talked about. So let's go ahead and make a test harness page. I'll call it testharness.html. Okay. So I have a bare bones HTML document here. So I'll just give it a little title. I'll say it's my test. I'm going to go ahead and include that source code that we just saw, which is called tools.js. so now I need to write some test code. Obviously, I'd probably want to put this in a separate file at the bare minimum. For now, I'm just going to stick it in line. So what can we do here? Well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to actually instantiate a new instance of a tools object. So let's just go ahead and do that. I'll say my tools equals new tools. And then I'm going to say my tools dot add item foo. And let's add another one. I'll say my tools dot add item bar. So I'm just literally executing the code, trying it out that I've written. It's as if I was using it, in my regular application, but I'm just writing this very special code and test file to exercise the source code. So now we have to check if it worked, right? So let's do something else here. Let's do var item equals my tools dot get primary item. So now we're also exercising the get primary item method. And now this is where we can check to see if it worked. So we're going to do what most of you are probably familiar with, is called an assertion. So we're going to assert that the value of item is what we expect it to be. So I'll say if item equals foo, I'm going to call pass, else fail. And I'll give it a message so we know what went wrong. Well, I'll say expected item to equal foo, but was the value of item. Okay. Now I actually have to implement these functions that I'm calling. So let's go ahead and create a pass function. I'll say alert, yay, we are writing solid code. Now I'm going to write my fail function. It's going to take a string message. I'm going to alert, uh-oh, and I'll add that message. All right, so I think I have everything working. I'm going to try it out. I'm going to test it out in a browser. So let's go back to my browser here. And looks like it's working as we expected. Yay, we are writing solid code. Awesome. So that's pretty cool. For purposes of the example, I'm just going to go ahead and make this actually fail. So let's say I thought that this worked somewhat differently. I said, okay, I think this should actually give me bar, right? So now if I run it, obviously it's going to fail. So it tells me, uh-oh, we expect it to equal foo, but oops. Oh, I have an error in my fail message. I think that's a double fail. Okay, let's run it again. Okay, uh-oh, expected item to equal bar, but was foo. Awesome. We just wrote our own testing framework. Very cool. Let's see here. So that's awesome, kind of. I don't think that everybody who wants to write a test should have to implement their own testing framework, and this one was obviously pretty awful. We had a bug in our own framework, so that's not so great. Okay, so unit testing kind of isn't so fun. Maybe we shouldn't do it after all, right? Not so fast. So actually, we have tools that can help us do this in a very easy and productive way. And I wanted to go through that somewhat painful example just to show how important tools like Venus or like Karma or like the intern are to help you write more tests much more productively and more efficiently. So let's take a look at how you would do something like this with Venus. Okay. All right. So Venus is a Node.js application. I'm not going to actually go through the process of installing it. It's very easy to install. If you've used Node before, you know that installing Node is very easy. If you haven't, you're going to have to take my word for it. Once you get Node installed, you get this package manager called Node Package Manager, npm. And to install Venus, all you would do is say npm install -g to install it globally, and then Venus. And if you go to venus.js.org, we have all kinds of documentation on there to help you get started. But for now, I have it running. So let's take a look at our code. So again, we have this code file that we're trying to test, right? Same file we were trying to test before. So let's see how we might write a test using Venus. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it tools.spec.js. This is just a JavaScript file. You can call it whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. I like to follow a convention of I basically use the name of the file I'm testing, and I stick spec onto it because it's a specification of how your code should work. But it's really up to you. So one of the nice things about Venus is that we are very flexible in that we interface with a variety of different third-party testing APIs. So you may have heard of tools such as Mocha or QUnit or Jasmine. These are all great tools. And when we set out to build Venus, we didn't want to completely reinvent the wheel, and we also knew that there's a lot of developers out there who already have opinions about which testing libraries they like, and we thought that we should work with all of them. So we do. So up here, I'm going to choose to use Mocha, so I can use an annotation. I'll just say Venus library Mocha. And I'll use another annotation to include my source code. Oops. So I'll say include tools.js. And that's pretty much it. I'm ready to go. So if you have used Mocha or Jasmine, this syntax may look familiar. If not, don't worry, it's pretty simple. Essentially, Mocha exposes this global function called describe that lets us say, hey, I'm going to start writing a new suite of tests. I'm going to call it tests for tools, or test for tools.js. Okay. And then I'm going to do pretty much the same thing I did before, except I'm going to call this function called it, which basically says I am creating a new test. And I will say it should return the primary item. All right. So here's where I get to write my test code. So I'll say my tools equals new tools. And it's pretty much what I did before, right? So I'm going to say my tools dot add item foo, my tools dot add item bar, and my tools dot add. I'll do one more. Add item. What should I add? Foo bar. Excellent. Okay. So now I've added some data to this awesome list that Tools keeps track of for me. Now I have to write my assertion. So I'm going to use a function called expect, which is how we do our assertions. So if you've used other if you've used other types of testing frameworks, maybe you used JUnit in the past, you might be more used to an assert statement. That's fine. You can use different test APIs, different assertion libraries with Venus, and it works. So it's really up to you how you like to write your tests. I happen to like using Mocha with the expect assertion framework, so that's what we're going to do here. So I'm going to say expect, and here I put the value that I'm asserting on. So I'm going to say expect my tools dot get primary item dot to be foo bar. Okay, and that's it. And now I should be able to run my test. So let's see if this works. So I'm coming to here. I'm in the directory where I put my files, and I'm just going to say Venus run-t to give it a test, tools.spec.js. And then I'm going to add this flag, which is -n. It's a shortcut for -s phantom. So Venus works with a bunch of different execution environments. One of the execution environments that we support is using a tool called Phantom.js, which is pretty cool because it's actually a headless WebKit browser. It starts up very quickly. It runs from the command line. You don't have to leave your terminal to run your tests. But at the same time, it's actually running in a real browser, which is pretty awesome. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Oh, we have a failure. So, oh, this is unfortunate. I think I have a tmux issue going on. Okay, so the first thing you'll see in yellow is it says Phantom version 1.8.1. So it's telling you the user agent that ran your test, which in this case is Phantom. Then you'll see what the label we gave it in the describe statement. So we said it's a test for tools.js. And then you get the test name. It should return the primary item, and it failed, and you get the message saying what went wrong. So we expected foo to equal foo bar. So clearly we have some issues with our code. We also get a nice little stack trace that will show us exactly where the error occurred in the code. So this is great. Sometimes, if you really need to debug what's going on, you want to be in the browser, right? You want to be able to open up Chrome DevTools and see poke around. So if I leave off this -n flag, then it's just going to start Venus, which is running a local web server, and it gives me the URL that I can navigate to if I actually want to run this test manually. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. You have to excuse me, I'm actually running two versions of Venus. We have a version that's hot off the presses, which has a little bit nicer UI, so let me run that one. Okay. So this is the Venus test runner UI. So you see at the top a big red bar, so that's probably not a good sign. It tells you that your test failed. And down below, you can see what went wrong. So it's basically exactly the same information that you got in your console. If you hover over this, you'll get your stack trace. The only difference is here I can actually go ahead and open up DevTools if I wanted to, set breakpoints, and debug through the code. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to come over to my sources. Okay. All right. And let me open up my source code file. Oops, that's my test. Let's go into tools.js. Okay, so stop that. So now I can look at my actual source code file in the browser, or I can look at the test. Wherever I want to set my breakpoints, however I want to debug, it's totally up to me. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and set a breakpoint right here, and I'll just refresh this page. Now we stopped there, so we can take a look at what's going on. So I'm going to just say, okay, let's go ahead and manually call my tools like get primary item. And I am going to call that, and that's going to be foo, which is not what I expect. So I'm going to go ahead and come into tools, and I'm just going to set a breakpoint here. Now I'm going to say, okay, what is this dot items equal to? So I'm expecting to say foo bar, but it's giving me foo. Well, it's pretty clear what's going on. I'm returning the first element in the array instead of the last element in the array, which is what I really want. This is a slightly contrived, simple example, but you can see how being able to pop open DevTools, set breakpoints, do your normal debugging thing is super helpful and will help you resolve issues you find yourself in. So that's running Venus. Let me go ahead. Ooh, don't want to do that. So let's go ahead and just go ahead and fix this, right? So I can see, coming back to my tools, I say, okay, I actually don't want to be returning the first item. I want to be returning the last item. So I'll say this dot items dot length -1, and then let's see if that works for me. Back to my browser, refresh. Okay, now it's passing. Hooray. All right. Okay. So that's cool. It's pretty easy to write your test. You don't have to worry about all that boilerplate code with your test harness page. You don't have to worry about including the code. You don't have to worry about like what happens if this file changes and I have to go rebuild that whole test harness page. It just sort of works. One of the things that I didn't show right there, but is also really powerful about Venus, is that it's going to talk to different execution environments, like I was mentioning earlier. So we showed it running in Phantom.js. We showed it running manually in the browser, but there's other systems it can interact with, which I'll talk about as we go through this diagram, which is going to explain the basic architecture and flow of actually executing a unit test in Venus. So what happens when you go ahead and just enter that command on the console? Well, we have a couple high-level components. So first you have your command line interface to Venus. This is where you type in your commands. Then we have this executor module, which takes the input sent to Venus and says, okay, I want to run this test, and let's use IE8. You can specify which browser you want to use, right? So the next thing that happens is the executor will actually parse that test file, parse out all of those annotations that we were writing, figure out what it needs to do. From there, it goes and talks to a UAC. So a UAC stands for User Agent Controller, and this is what controls the browsers, or the different, whether it's a real browser, whether it's something like Selenium Grid, whether it's something like Sauce Labs. We have an internal infrastructure called SuperGrid, which is sort of our own version of Selenium Grid. So we can talk to all of these systems. So in this case, we want to use IE8, which is not installed, obviously, on my Mac here. So we could go and talk to SuperGrid and say, hey, please give me an IE8 VM. And oh, by the way, can you go ahead and request this test URL from a server that's running on my box? And Venus will just magically make that all happen for you. Next, we go ahead and we come back from the executor, and the executor says, okay, here you go. Here's the fully automatically generated test harness page with all the resources you need. And you can go ahead and run this in your browser. So an IE8 running on that VM somewhere, we don't know where or really care, we'll execute that code. Once the test is finished running, we send the results back to the Venus server that's running on the local computer. And we do this using Socket.io. So Socket.io, if you haven't used it, is a pretty nice abstraction on top of WebSockets for browsers that support WebSockets. It has a variety of transports that we'll fall back to for older browsers. Then the executor has the results, and we just print them out. And the users can see whether their test passed or failed. And that's pretty much it. That's a slightly simplified view. There's a couple of other components going on, but that's the main execution flow of running a Venus unit test. So that's Venus. What do you guys think? Does it seem useful? A little bit? Well, we hope so. If you're interested in finding out more about Venus, and we obviously encourage you to do this, and not even just Venus, right? I mean, unit testing in general, I think, is a very compelling topic. It's something that we all need to take more seriously if we're not already doing it. So check us out at venus.js.org. This is our project site. We have some documentation up there. We're working all the time to make it better. We'd love to have you contribute as well if you get interested in the project. Venus is completely open sourced, and you can find our link to our GitHub up there. You can file tickets against us. We have a Google Groups discussion forum where you can provide feedback, submit feature requests, try to get help with issues you might be seeing. And we hope you'll actually install and play with it. It's pretty easy to do. Like I mentioned, it's not too difficult to get up and running. And the final thing is you really just have to, if you haven't done JavaScript unit testing before, you really just have to do it, right? You just have to get experience doing it. There's a lot more to learn that I didn't cover in this talk. One of the big challenges for many people when they start writing JavaScript unit tests is they have to sort of rethink how they structure their code, because it's very easy to write any code in JavaScript, maybe in particular, in such a way that you can't really test it, right? So you have to understand how to write modular, how to write testable code. So that's very important. And there's a lot of great resources out there. There's some books I could recommend. Please talk to me afterwards if you're interested in this topic. Like I mentioned, there's other tools and frameworks out there I encourage you to check out, see what other people are doing, and just get involved, and let's all write cleaner code. So thank you very much. So just one quick announcement. That's the end of my talk. Next month, we're actually not going to be here at LinkedIn. We're going to JobVite, and they're hosting us for a talk on Angular.js. Their engineering team seems to be very enamored with Angular, and they're going to tell us why. So hope you'll check it out. It's going to be, I think, on June 27th. We'll get that posted up on the meetup page within a week or so. And I hope to see you guys there. So thanks again for coming out. And please feel free to stick around. And I'll be here for as long as you want to answer questions, chat. I think there's a lot more beer and pizza. So enjoy. Thanks.